Let's go back, not to 1492, but to the world that existed before that date became a dividing line in history. Picture North America in the year 1000 CE. This is not the untamed wilderness of frontier mythology. This is a continent of approximately 50 million people, organized into hundreds of distinct nations, speaking countless languages, practicing sophisticated agriculture, and building cities that would rival anything in Europe. In the heart of what is now Illinois near modern-day St. Louis stands Cahokia, a city of 20,000 inhabitants, larger than London at the same time. Massive earthen pyramids rise from the floodplains, the largest of which covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is a planned metropolis with residential districts, public plazas, astronomical observatories, and a complex social hierarchy. Trade goods flow into Cahokia from across the continent: copper from Lake Superior, shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians. This is not a village. This is an empire's capital, the center of a cultural and economic network that stretches for thousands of miles. Meanwhile, in the southwest, the ancestors of modern Pueblo peoples are constructing massive multi-story apartment complexes in the cliffs and canyons. Chaco Canyon in New Mexico becomes a ceremonial center connected to outlying communities by a network of roads so precisely engineered that some run absolutely straight for dozens of miles, ignoring topography. In the Pacific Northwest, coastal nations develop such wealth from salmon fishing and trade that they create a society based not on agriculture but on managed abundance, complete with elaborate gift-giving ceremonies that redistribute wealth and establish social hierarchies. The Haudenosaunee, the people you might know as the Iroquois, forge a confederacy of 5 nations bound by the Great Law of Peace, a sophisticated democratic constitution that governs relations between sovereign peoples through a system of checks, balances, and collective decision-making. This isn't primitive tribalism. These are complex civilizations with art, architecture, astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, trade, diplomacy, and philosophy. They had transformed the landscape of North America through controlled burning that created vast parklands and increased biodiversity, through agriculture that domesticated crops like corn, beans, and squash that would eventually feed the entire world, through irrigation systems in the desert southwest that made arid lands bloom. The forests that Europeans would later describe as pristine wilderness were actually carefully managed landscapes, shaped by human hands over thousands of years. Then 1492 happens, but here's what you need to understand. Christopher Columbus didn't discover America. He stumbled into a hemisphere already teeming with human civilization, already mapped and named and claimed by the people who lived here. What Columbus actually discovered was a sea route that would allow Europeans to bring something to the Americas that would prove more devastating than any army: disease. Within a century of first contact, 90% of the native population of the Americas would be dead. Not from warfare, though there was plenty of that. Not from enslavement, though that was ubiquitous. But from smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, diseases to which native peoples had no immunity. Entire civilizations collapsed, cities were abandoned, agricultural systems failed, oral histories were lost, languages died with their last speakers. The scale of this catastrophe cannot be overstated. This was the greatest loss of human life in recorded history, a demographic collapse so complete that it literally changed the Earth's climate. Abandoned agricultural fields across the Americas grew back into forests, pulling so much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that global temperatures dropped, contributing to the little ice age that gripped the planet in the 17th century. This wasn't just a tragedy for native peoples. This was a cataclysm that reshaped the entire world. And here's the perverse irony. The very emptiness that resulted from this plague-driven apocalypse is what allowed Europeans to perpetuate the myth of virgin wilderness. By the time the Pilgrims arrived in 1620, the plagues had already done their work. The Puritans walked through ghost towns and cultivated fields reverting to forest, and convinced themselves they'd found an empty land prepared by God for their arrival. They literally thanked divine providence for the epidemic that had cleared the land of its original inhabitants. But the story doesn't end with disease and death. The survivors adapted, resisted, and shaped the emerging colonial world in ways that remain invisible in most American history textbooks. Let's talk about what native peoples actually gave to the European colonists, not in some vague spiritual sense, but in concrete, measurable ways that made the survival and success of European colonies possible. First, food. The Pilgrims at Plymouth were starving and incompetent at survival in their new environment until Tisquantum, known to history as Squanto, taught them how to cultivate corn, where to fish, how to gather wild edibles. This wasn't charity. Tisquantum had his own political motivations, his own agenda for navigating the catastrophic collapse of his world. But without the agricultural knowledge of native peoples, the Plymouth colony would have failed like so many others. And it wasn't just corn. Potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, vanilla, tobacco, rubber, and countless other crops that Native Americans had spent thousands of years developing through selective breeding would eventually transform the global economy. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old and New Worlds, was overwhelmingly a transfer of Native American innovation to the rest of the world. Second, geography. Europeans didn't explore North America, native guides showed them where to go. The maps that opened up the continent to European exploitation were drawn from native knowledge. The trails that became colonial roads and eventually highways were native trade routes that had existed for centuries. The strategic locations where Europeans built their forts and cities were places native peoples had already identified as important. Europeans didn't discover the Mississippi River or the Great Lakes or the mountain passes of the Rockies. They were shown these places by people who had known them for generations. Third, military alliance. The colonial powers, British, French, Spanish, Dutch, did not conquer North America through European military might. They conquered it by forming alliances with some native nations against others, by exploiting existing rivalries and conflicts, by playing tribes off against each other. The French and Indian War, the conflict that would ultimately determine whether North America would be French or British, was fought primarily by native warriors on both sides. The outcome of that war had less to do with European military strategy than it did with which side could maintain better alliances with native nations. The British won because the Haudenosaunee Confederacy chose to support them, a choice the Haudenosaunee would later regret. Fourth, political philosophy. Here's where the story gets really interesting and really controversial. The founding fathers of the United States didn't invent democracy out of thin air, and they didn't simply copy it from ancient Greece or Rome. They were directly influenced by the political systems of Native American confederacies, particularly the Haudenosaunee. Benjamin Franklin in the 1750s explicitly held up the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as a model for colonial unity. The Albany Plan of Union, which Franklin drafted, borrowed organizational concepts from the Great Law of Peace. The idea that separate sovereign nations could form a voluntary union while maintaining their individual identities, this was not a European concept. This was Native American political innovation, observed and adapted by colonial thinkers who were desperate to find a way to unite the fractious colonies. The Constitution's system of checks and balances, its federalist structure, its provision for adding new states to the Union, these echo the structure of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which had been successfully governing relations between sovereign nations for centuries before Europeans arrived. This doesn't mean the Constitution is simply a copy of native political systems. It's not. The Founding Fathers also drew on European Enlightenment philosophy, English common law, and their own experiences with colonial governance. But to ignore the Native American influence is to miss a crucial piece of the puzzle. The United States is in part built on a political foundation that was already here. Now let's talk about removal and resistance. By the early 19th century, the young United States faced a problem. Native nations still controlled vast territories that American settlers wanted. Treaties had been signed, boundaries had been agreed upon, but American expansion was an unstoppable force driven by ideology, manifest destiny, the belief that Americans had a divine right to control the entire continent from coast to coast. The civilized tribes of the Southeast, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, had adapted to American culture in exactly the ways they'd been told to. They'd adopted European-style agriculture, Christianity, written constitutions, and formal governments. The Cherokee had their own newspaper printed in their own alphabet, invented by Sequoyah. They had built schools, churches, and plantations. They had done everything the United States claimed to want from them. It didn't matter. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the forced relocation of all native peoples east of the Mississippi to designated Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. The Cherokee fought back not with weapons but with law. They took their case to the Supreme Court and won. In Worcester v. Georgia, the court ruled that the Cherokee Nation was sovereign and that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee lands. President Jackson reportedly responded, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." The executive branch simply ignored the Supreme Court. Between 1831 and 1839, the Cherokee and other southeastern tribes were forcibly marched westward on what became known as the Trail of Tears. 4,000 Cherokee died during the march, 1 in 4. The Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole suffered similar losses. This was ethnic cleansing, plain and simple, carried out by the United States government in direct violation of its own treaties and its own Supreme Court. But removal didn't solve the problem from the government's perspective, it just moved it. In Indian Territory and across the western frontier, native nations continued to resist American expansion. The Plains Wars of the mid to late 19th century were the last sustained military resistance to American colonization. Nations like the Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, Apache, and Nez Perce fought to defend their lands and their way of life against an enemy with overwhelming numerical and technological advantages. These wars produced moments of native military victory. The Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors wiped out Custer's 7th Cavalry, but the overall trajectory was inevitable. The United States had industrialized. It had railroads, telegraphs, repeating rifles, and most devastatingly, a strategy of total war that targeted the economic base of Plains societies. The U.S. Army deliberately slaughtered the buffalo herds that sustained Plains nations, killing millions of animals not for food or resources but specifically to starve native peoples into submission. By 1890, armed resistance was effectively over. The massacre at Wounded Knee in December of that year, where the 7th Cavalry killed more than 250 Lakota men, women, and children, marked the symbolic end of the Indian Wars. But the assault on native cultures was just beginning. If military conquest couldn't eliminate native peoples, then cultural genocide would finish the job. That was the explicit goal of the boarding school system established in the late 19th century. Native children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to residential schools where they were forbidden to speak their languages, practice their religions, or maintain any connection to their cultures. The motto of these institutions, coined by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, was "Kill the Indian, save the man." Children had their hair cut, their traditional clothing burned, their names changed to English ones. They were punished for speaking their native languages, sometimes beaten, sometimes having their mouths washed out with soap. They were taught that their cultures were primitive and savage, that their parents were heathens, that their only hope for salvation was complete assimilation into white American society. The psychological trauma of this system echoes through generations. The boarding schools didn't close until the 1970s. Survivors are still alive today, still dealing with the trauma of having been torn from their families and cultures. The intergenerational effects, addiction, poverty, family dysfunction, loss of language and tradition, are the direct legacy of a policy designed to destroy native cultures from the inside. At the same time, the United States was breaking up collectively held reservation lands through the Dawes Act of 1887, which divided tribal territories into individual plots that could be bought and sold. The goal was to destroy the tribal land base and force native peoples into individual property ownership and farming, to turn them into Americans. In practice, it was another massive land grab. Any surplus land after the allotments were made was opened up to white settlement. Native peoples lost 2/3 of their remaining land base, some 90 million acres, between 1887 and 1934. Throughout all of this, removal, military conquest, cultural genocide, land theft, native peoples resisted. Not always through warfare, but through adaptation, through legal challenges, through cultural persistence, through simple survival. They maintained their languages in secret. They practiced their religions underground. They told their stories and sang their songs where the authorities couldn't hear. They endured. The 20th century brought new challenges and new forms of resistance. The Indian New Deal of the 1930s reversed some of the most destructive policies, recognizing tribal sovereignty and restoring some degree of self-governance to native nations. But it was followed by the termination era of the 1950s, when the federal government again tried to end its recognition of tribes and force assimilation. The 1960s and 70s saw the rise of the Red Power movement, with activists occupying Alcatraz Island, the Bureau of Indian Affairs building, and Wounded Knee, demanding treaty rights, land return, and sovereignty. These protests brought national attention to ongoing injustices and helped spark a revival of native cultural pride and political activism. Today, Native Americans are still here, still fighting for sovereignty, land rights, and cultural survival. The struggles continue over pipeline construction on native lands, over water rights, over sacred sites, over jurisdiction and treaty rights. But there's also a renaissance of native languages, art, literature, and political power. Native nations are reasserting their sovereignty, developing their economies, and reclaiming their histories. So what does all of this mean for how we understand American history? It means that the story of the United States cannot be told honestly without centering the native peoples who were here first, who shaped this land, who influenced the political structures that Americans claim as their own invention, who survived centuries of deliberate genocide, and who continue to exist as sovereign nations within the borders of the United States. The myth of virgin wilderness was a lie that justified theft. The myth of vanishing Indians was propaganda that allowed Americans to avoid confronting ongoing injustices. The myth of primitive savages was racism that denied the complexity and sophistication of native civilizations. The real history is this: North America was not empty when Europeans arrived. It was full of people, full of cities, full of agricultural innovation, full of political philosophy, full of art and culture and trade and diplomacy. Those people didn't vanish when the colonists arrived. They died in enormous numbers from disease, they were killed in wars and massacres, they were forcibly removed from their lands, they were subjected to cultural genocide, but they survived. And their descendants are still here, still sovereign nations with their own governments and cultures, still fighting for their rights, still shaping America in ways that most Americans don't recognize or acknowledge. Every time you eat corn or potatoes or tomatoes, you're benefiting from thousands of years of native agricultural innovation. Every time you drive down a highway that follows an old native trade route, You're traveling paths that were established long before the United States existed. Every time you think about American democracy and freedom, you're engaging with ideas that were influenced by native political philosophy. The hidden history of America before the United States is actually the foundation of everything that came after. You cannot understand American history without understanding this. You cannot understand who Americans are without understanding whose land this was, whose ideas helped shape American institutions, whose labor and knowledge made colonial survival possible, and whose descendants are still here, still sovereign, still maintaining cultures and traditions that predate the United States by thousands of years. This is not ancient history confined to the distant past. This is living history that continues to shape American society today in ways both obvious and subtle, acknowledged and hidden. The real story of America begins not with European arrival, but with the civilizations that were already here, civilizations that were nearly destroyed but never completely extinguished, nations that adapted and endured and continue to exist. That's the history you weren't taught. That's the history that changes everything.